But we're not going to be bouncing around too much. We mainly are going to be starting a series in Daniel, actually. But who here wishes that they were somebody that always did what they said they're going to do?
Me.
We wish that, right? Sometimes we have small reasons why we don't do the things that we say we're going to do. We forget, we get too lazy, we get distracted. But other times, our faith, our conviction, or our goals are put to the test. It's not that we forgot or we didn't have enough time, but simply we were tempted to compromise. We were tempted to give in or make it a little bit easier on ourselves. Compromising can just be so easy. You know, we can be bought at such a low price sometimes. At times we do it without thinking, meaning like, oh wow, did I just do that? Did I just forget? But other times, there are times where we are just having a conversation with ourselves, shouting at ourselves like, why are you doing this? Yeah, I don't know if you've ever done that where, like sometimes I'll be at like a restaurant or some place and I'm just hanging around. And then I feel like God's put on my heart to share with my faith with somebody, whether that's a waiter or somebody that's sitting around. But then I start to do like conditions in my mind. I'm like, okay, God, I hear it, but I'll only share with them if they're there by the end of my coffee, right? Or something like that. And so I take a long time drinking, you know. But then they're still there and you're just shouting at yourself, open up your mouth, just do it, get open, like go share your faith, get courage. But there's sometimes we just find ourselves compromising. Today we're going to be looking at we're going to be starting a sermon series in the book of Daniel.
Come on.
And for those, you know, to summarize the book of Daniel, if you've never jumped into it, the theme could be without compromise. We're going to really see here that God is teaching us through this book on how to live a life for God, even though we can be in exile. Exile means outside of God's presence or outside of God's people, yet we still live for Him. You know, and to be honest, a Christian life is a life of exile. 100% it's the life of exile. We are built for heaven, but we still have to dwell on earth.
Yeah.
That's what we're thinking of. We're thinking about God. We're thinking about spiritual things. We're thinking about putting our treasures in heaven, yet we ain't there, right? And so we're in exile still at this time. You know, our society, we even feel that a little bit more, that we're exiled in what we believe and how we act and what we do and the stances that we make. That we're almost like on the outside of society sometimes. You know, sometimes we can even feel like our society used to be devoted to biblical values. I remember back then that they used to preach the Bible a little bit more. They used to have this type of morality, but not so much anymore. And even more so, they can make us look crazy for doing so. You know, it's kind of funny whenever somebody of the world tries to convince me what I'm doing is crazy, and yet they kind of like advertise their life. They're like, what? You had your first kiss with your wife on your wedding day? That's just so weird. That's what? Well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm like, okay, explain your life to me then. Well, you know, I've had like a few boyfriends and a few girlfriends, and you know, I've had relationships and things like that. But you know, at least I get to have fun. You know, I'm always angry and sad, and I never really get open because you can't trust people, and you know, you can't like really let people into your life. I'm like, you're trying to convince me that I'm crazy? And that's the life that you live? No way, right? You couldn't pay me to live that life. And yet they do that to us. You know, I remember even just recently on the news, back in America, in Washington, that one of these coaches in high school, he was coaching American football, and he's actually going to the Supreme Court because he might be getting fired because usually before the games, you would always say a prayer. And even for me, I remember growing up in America, if you're a part of sports, 100%, you would always do this, at least in California. We would say a prayer as a team, everyone hold each other's hands. We'll say a prayer that we all come out safely. And yet, now that's something like weird. People are going to court for something like this. It's like this life and everything is becoming more and more exiled in society. We're going to read here even more than just how we feel in exile. We're going to see even what Daniel was going through. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his own God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. See, right now, it feels like we're parachuting into the story, right? We kind of jump right into who's Jehoiakim, who's Babylon, or who's all these different things. For most, these verses are enough to scare people to just like, all right, let's just read another book, right? For a lot of people, that's kind of how it feels, but let's understand a little bit kind of what's going on. So in brief history, there was a reason that they were doing this. Just to help out people that are probably not too familiar with the Bible, let's see which is the best way. Bam, there we go. All right, cool. So Exhibit A. So we're parachuting into the Bible story right here. And for those that aren't too familiar with the Bible, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a rundown what's going on and what we're jumping into. So God called this guy named Abraham to go into this promised land, and he wanted to multiply his descendants. And so we have Abraham all the way to the beginning, and that little tree thing, that's his family. He becomes one family and becomes nearly a couple million people. From there, a guy named Joseph brings the descendants of Israel into Egypt. And they stay there for about 400 years. Then Moses leads them out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. And so that's where Moses is taking them out. They lived there for about 400 years without any kings. So they didn't have any kings, but they had people that were kind of ruling or overseeing the people called the period of Judges. And so that's where you get the book of Judges. After that, they want a king. Then we have Saul, David, and Solomon. The tribes were reunited. There were 12 tribes in that. But then they started to have a civil war after King Solomon. And so it gets divided to the northern kingdom, which is called Israel. That has 10 tribes a part of it. Then you have the southern kingdom, which is called Judah, which has 2 tribes. The northern kingdom lasted about 209 years before being conquered by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom, 325 years until conquered by the Babylonians. And it took the Babylonians 3 times to invade them, but after 20 years of the first invasion, they get destroyed. So just to give you a brief, that's kind of like the first couple books of the Bible just right there. And we're jumping into the story of when Babylon is starting to take over the southern kingdom, Judah, and particularly kind of like their headquarters, their capital, Jerusalem. So that gives you a little bit of brief history. If you don't know what's going on, this is the story of God's people. So we get jumped into then Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians. His very name actually honors his god, Nabu, or Nebu, which you'll find in the Bible. His name actually means Nabu protects the crown. So he's coming in there attacking Israel right here. And in his first invasion, why does he not conquer? And he had to leave it half besieged? Mainly because his father ended up dying. And you can see that throughout history. So he had to actually return to Babylon, which is about 500 miles. And he does that in 2 weeks, which is pretty crazy when you only have like a carriage and horseback. That's really, really fast. He had to return back because he wanted to secure his place on the throne. If he wasn't there, any cousin or somebody else can take up the throne. So he had to go back. But even though he didn't conquer Jerusalem or all of Judah entirely, we see that he takes some things back with him. He takes certain things. One, he takes the articles of the couple of things that are in the temple of God. He puts that in his temple. And the other thing is that he takes a king with him as well. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he takes captive and takes back with him. You know, and this is important that we see here what actually God is allowing to happen. See, was Babylon stronger than the nation of Judah? 100%. It was stronger. Absolutely. But why did they get conquered? Well, it says here for a little bit, it says God delivered them into their hands. See, God could have easily destroyed the whole army like he did the army of Egypt, right? He could have done something that could have totally destroyed them. But we see here that there's a little bit of judgment happening to the nation or the land of Judah here. Yes, when we compare armies, 100%, Babylon was going to conquer. But it was mainly because God didn't defend them that they get conquered. Well, what was going on in Israel? Well, Israel mainly, if you read throughout these books, had a great idolatry. Mainly that they were worshiping other gods. See, there was many gods in the land Canaan, but they started to worship them and adopt them into their own worship. And the 2 main gods is Baal, or Belial, and Asherah. So these are the 2 main kind of pagan gods that they started to worship at this time. Baal, or Belial, was the god of weather. You know, he's actually pictured, if you look him up, he's pictured with a thunderbolt in his hands, kind of like Zeus. And the reason that people would worship him, specifically during that time in an agriculture society, that, hey, the weather really determine your success. If rain didn't come, you're not getting any money. And so they would worship this god for success, for money, for riches. Then you have Asherah. This is the god of fertility. It also had to do with kind of like your fertile lands and stuff like that, but it also meant fertile in producing, reproducing. And so to actually worship this god, what you would do is when you went to a temple of Asherah, you would worship the god by getting with other prostitutes. And see, we see that the two idols that they mainly started to adopt in their society and their culture was the worship of wealth and the worship of sex. Aren't we glad that the worship of sex and money have been erased since Israel?
Yeah.
Of course not, right? Yeah, but like that's still today. Right. Even today, we see that these things start to come back. And because of these idols, God allowed them to be judged. God commanded them as well that they were supposed to give a Sabbath rest to the land. We know Sabbath, even for us or for some denominations, mean like, okay, you rest on one day. But God also demanded that for the land, and Israel wasn't doing that as well. And so he said, okay, you're not doing that? I'm going to kick you guys out, get you enslaved, and so the land can rest. So we see that real judgment was coming upon them. And he didn't just take the articles when Nebuchadnezzar was returning, but he took something else with him. He took some more things with him. If we read here, Daniel chapter 1, verse 3 through 4. It says here, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's servants some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. And so I know a lot of this is teaching, but just to make sure we all understand what's happening. So not only did he take the articles from God's temple, but he took the best of the best, the brightest and best people of Israel's to kind of be, to come into Babylon to make them kind of like ambassadors to the land. So they would get these people, make them slaves, get them to learn the literature and the culture of the Babylonians, so whenever the place that they conquered, they can go send them, because they know the culture and everything, and kind of understand as ambassadors to what's going on, to quiet down rebellions. And so they took young men, usually ranging from about 13 to 20 years old, and this is where we get the story of Daniel. Daniel is part of these young men who is now being exiled from his land, totally taken away from his land, and now in this place that is foreign to him. And this was true exile. You know, your community that you had, it's now gone. The institutions that taught a form of learning of God, even though they had idolatry and stuff, that's completely gone now. The temples that gave true worship to God, completely gone. This is what true exile looks like. And on one part, the king was actually smart to do so. Not only does he get the best of the best and get to learn their culture as well, but he also has hostages. So if ever, Israel and Judah starts trying to fight again, they have the nobility and the royals that will kill these guys if you keep going, if you keep trying to fight. So in this, when we think about a life of exile, right? If that was us, taken away from our family, taken away from our land, taken away from everything you know, that can lead us to a couple different things. It can lead us to despair. Dang, what am I supposed to do now? Into bitterness. I hate Babylonians. I'm never going to forgive them. It can lead us to hate not only the enemies, but it can also to hate us to hate God. God, why did you allow this to happen? You stopped the Egyptians, why not the Babylonians? Maybe it just tempts people to forget and move on. Well, you know what? God failed me. Well, let me just become a Babylonian now. At the end, it might just tempt people just to give up. Nothing else is going to happen. We're going to see here, though, in the story as we run into Daniel, that this was a man of no compromise. Not compromise just in his stance and worship for God, but even in the compromise of how he viewed God and continued to worship him. The title of my lesson is Faithful in Exile. Point number 1, it starts small. It starts small. Read verse 5 through 7. The king assigned them being those that have been exiled and taken, a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The king official gave them new names. To Daniel, he named them the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So first of all, we see, okay, these are the exiles. They're coming now into the Babylonians. First of all, we see that they're eating pretty good. Maybe for the first time in all exile history, these guys are eating what the kings eat. That's some good food. Specifically back then, when the kind of difference between the poor and the rich and the difference of food, amazing. So they're taken in, they're already like welcomed on the king's table. It's awesome. And then they're given new names. And names back there were very important, right? You even get to see even how Jesus was named and the importance of his name. God said, hey, you will name him this. Yeah. He didn't say what you're going to feed him or, what kind of pet you're going to give him or any of those things. He talked about their name. God throughout the Bible always changed people's names for the better. But we see here that their names are changed for the worse. See, their names in the beginning were actually connected to the God of Israel. And now their new names were getting changed to get to the gods of Babylonian. So if you look at Daniel, Daniel's name means God is my judge. Belteshazzar means the prince of the Babylonian God. Hananiah, beloved by Yahweh. Shadrach, illuminated by the sun god. Wow. Mishael, who is as God. Like, God is amazing. Who's that God? Meshach, who is like Venus, one of their gods as well. Azariah, the Lord is my help. Abednego, the servant of Nego, which is one of their gods as well. So not only did they start to just pull them in, but they started to change their names and go, you are now Babylonian. But who here knows what their names mean? Does anybody know? What does your name mean? Fair.
Joy.
Joy.
Bearer of Christ.
Bearer of Christ. That's pretty good. Beautiful. Okay, yeah. My name means God is gracious. I just found that out. For all of my life, I kept telling people God is faithful, but, I lied to them. But it's pretty crazy, right? They're changing their name because even God saw their names very important. What if your name was changed to what you currently worship?
Come on, Sean.
What will your name be changed to? Would it be changed to Monet? Do you worship wealth? Would it be changed to something about the earth? You worship the earth. Would it be changed to something about your family? See, the world always wants to tell you who you are and what you're going to worship. But then we have Jesus who comes into our lives and say, I want you to follow me and be my disciple. Right. There's a huge difference. See, everyone is always being influenced by somebody, 100%. Sometimes people come in there with a fear in coming to church and like, well, you guys are going to teach me what you believe. What the heck else do you want us to do? Like, what do you mean? Of course we're going to teach you what you want to. Yes, we're going to influence you about Jesus, 100%. But the world's doing the same thing to you. Yeah. The world's trying to influence you and tell you who you're supposed to worship and things. God just wants you to worship him, 100%. The world's trying to tell you who you're going to do or who you're going to be. God's doing the same thing, who you're going to listen to. Yeah. But we see here that, yes, all these things start to happen. He comes into it. He's becoming new. They're changing their names. But verse 8 tells us something small about Daniel not having compromise in his heart. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief officials for permission not to defile himself this way. We see here that Daniel starts to make a stand. He needs to pollute. And this meant not just so much like the human body and everything, but more spiritual pollution. So what was defiling about it? Why did he not want to eat their food? Well, mainly because it wouldn't have been kosher. For those that don't know, kosher means that the kosher meat would come from animals that had split hooves. So like cows, sheep, and goats, and that they chewed their cud. These type of animals eat particularly digested, and it returns to the stomach, so they eat it, comes back up, they chew it again, it goes back and forth, and things like that, so cows. But example for one that is not kosher meat is pigs. They have split hooves, but they don't chew their cud. Am I saying that right word? Cud? C-U-D? Yeah. So for many Jews, kosher was more than just eating healthy. Again, it was a spiritual reverence to their worshiping God. And so even in slaughtering the animal is very important. They would kill it in a way where they would cut the neck, and it was the easiest way or the fastest way for the animal to bleed out and die. And so for him to come into this new land, he knew that this food would have not been kosher. Because the meat given by the Babylonians, one, for sure, not kosher, but also that their food might have been sacrificed to their idols. So it was kind of like, kill two birds with one cow situation, where they're going to sacrifice to their idols as well as they're going to feed the other people. And so when Daniel started to see this, he understood that this wasn't good. He understood that this meant more than just adopting their culture and things. This was starting to worship their other gods. See, this is crazy though, because he did not object to his new name. We don't see him getting mad about that. He didn't object to the new education. And maybe, yes, obviously, he didn't have a say in where he was going to live. He is in exile. But he starts to say no to the food. He made a big deal over something super small. Yet he saw it as his conviction. See, when we think about not compromise, we get, again, pretty romantic in our ideas of what this looks like. We see movies of doing great things for their beliefs and their dreams. And we go, well, that's what it means not to compromise. Even this week, it marks the traditional day when 40 soldiers of the Roman Empire were sentenced to freeze to death because of their convictions in Christianity. So 40 members of the Roman 12th Legion were stripped and forced into a frozen lake to freeze to death. And reportedly, they also had hot baths right next to it, so it would tempt any of the Christians, soldiers, to renounce their faith and to jump into them, and that they can use them doing so. However, one of them actually does it. And the 40 soldiers, one of them jumps out doing that, but one of the soldiers that saw him do it, he gets converted to Christianity, and he takes off his armor, and he walks into the lake. And I put the little link there on the email for you to read it because it was very, very encouraging. But when we think of not compromising, we go, I want to be part of their number. Right? That's awesome. 40 soldiers gave up their life for Christianity. I want to be that. We don't think that compromising is small. See, compromising is small things in our life. You compromise when you take another bite of the apple, like Adam and Eve. Compromising is looking the other way. Compromising is forgetting the small things. I think even in our video this morning, we got to see people not compromise. And we think, how would I be if I was there? How would we be if we were in Kiev? How would our faith be tested? We think, well, these guys are not compromising. We think about the kid in India. He had drug problems and in gangs and stuff, and yet he got converted to Christianity. Think about the ministry that's starting in prison right now. How awesome is that? That's amazing. But compromising actually starts small. See, before we get tested there, we have to think about in our lives where we're allowing devil to get into the details. Where we're allowing the world to call us to fall in line. Our families may not say that, hey, you can't be a Christian. Go into the frozen lake. They may not say that. But they will say, finish your chores before you go to church. They will say, you have to put the family first. They will say things like that is just trying to get you in small details. Your job doesn't care what you believe, but they will call you to stay late. But they will say, hey, if you don't do these things, you won't get a promotion. Right? They're trying to get you to compromise. Your friends, they'll support you 100%. But they'll still think and act weird when you don't go out cursing with them, drinking, sleeping around. They'll make you feel weird and trying to get you to compromise. See, it's the small things that we compromise in. And Daniel stood for no compromise. We can even do that spiritually. Not even outside, but inwardly. But are we compromising in our prayers? Well, hey, I prayed a little bit at least. You know, when someone asks you, you can at least say, I've done that 100% in my early Christianity, where I prayed. So if somebody asks me if I prayed, I can say yes, you know, and they'll say, how long? I say, well, time is relative, you know, right? We can do that. You know, are we compromising in our prayers? Are you compromising in you reading the Bible? To be honest, that doesn't hurt anybody but yourself.
Yeah.
Are we compromising in our ministries? Not sharing our faith, not going after it? Are we compromising in our confessions? You know, I've done that before where I will confess most of it, but leave a little bit on the side. You know, I just compromising. I want to hold this. Are we compromising in our worship and singing for God? Do we even compromise in that? Like, God, you see me. It's not about anybody else. God, you see me.
Yeah.
Do we compromise in our giving, in our contribution? Do we find ourselves compromising in this way? See, what I really love is the example of Daniel here, is that his relationship with God touched everything in his life, even in what he allowed himself to eat. We think that our worship is displayed in the big area of our lives, but it's actually in the details that we show that we follow God.
Yeah.
You know, I have a question. Is the devil in your details? Is the devil in your details? You know, because I'm not going to lie. To be honest, I can be an expert at coming up with excuses. I don't know if it's a spiritual gift or something that God has bestowed on me, but you know, we can do that, you know? And to be honest, I think Daniel could have had so many excuses of why not to do this, right? I can't reject the king. It's not just his official. The king said this. This is the king. I won't stand out. You know, I can't do this. And sometimes we think that way as well. I don't want to stand out as a Christian. I don't want to do that. But it doesn't make any sense. What is normal, or what should be normal in our society? If I say I'm going to be a Christian on Sunday morning, it makes sense to be a Christian on Monday morning. That just makes sense. That should be normal.
Yeah.
But what's normal in our society now is like, I'm a Christian on Sunday morning and not for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty weird. That's like a flexitarian again. You know? No, I'm joking. I'm just joking. But like it's like right? We should. But it's the same. It's like it should be normal for us to consistently worship God. You know, he could have been like, well, you know, to get along, you have to go along. Let me just eat what they eat, but in my heart, I'm not going to worship their gods that this is sacrificed to. In my heart, I'm just going to say, God, you know I'm worshiping you. Wow. The excuses, there can be real punishments. People have died and suffered a lot more for a lot less. You know, well, the food must have been good. Promotion sounds pretty good at my job. Well, everyone else is doing it. I'm away from home. It's God's fault that he sent me here. There could have been so many excuses for Daniel just to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. But instead, he holds on his convictions with God.
Come on.
Where do you compromise in your worship to God? Our worship is shown in every area of our lives. My first challenge is find an area in your life where you allowed compromise to come in. Get rid of the devil in your details. Point number 2, it ends in his hands. See, Daniel was without excuse. It says here that he resolved, meaning purpose in his heart, that before he got there, he was not going to eat. He didn't care what they were going to say. He does ask permission, but he already resolved, I'm not doing this regardless of what they say. And he did not do it in a way that brought out bitterness, right? He didn't go out there without wisdom or respect. He did not go like, you Babylonians, look at all that you're doing. And he didn't discourage other Israelites that might have been eating this. He just simply like, hey, this is my conviction. This is where I'm going to stand. And he was willing to be put to the test. Not just him, but God. See, what's crazy is that God failed him in the promised land, but now he was testing God again in exile. There's a lot of faith that Daniel has right here. Like, God didn't rescue me in the promised land. I am here, but God's going to show up now. Pretty crazy. Let's continue reading. Verse 9 through 13. Now God has caused the officials to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Already we're starting to see God is intimate in this situation right here. But the officials told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. Daniel said to the guard, who the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. You know, it's awesome that we see here for just a little bit that when you actually start to stand for your convictions, you make life harder for yourself. You actually do. It gets a little bit harder to hold on to things. You know, your convictions should constantly get you in trouble with the world. Should constantly. You know, we got to read or see about, and many of us have heard already, but about our story of our new brother in Samoa. And him putting, or at least the church putting out there his conviction to, say, hey, I'm not a Mormon, and denounce those things as well as Catholicism. And there have been, I think they said, 1,700 comments on there, on that one photo, or roughly around that, of just denouncing him and persecution and all these things. It got him in trouble. But yet this brother is fired up. There's actually a story. Authorities just recently in northeast China detained another Christian woman for repeatedly attempting to share the gospel with the Chinese president. This woman has been attempted 50 times now. She's been arrested 50 times for her conviction to go and share her faith with the Chinese president. And I think even for us, we can worry about our church that we have in Crouching Tiger and go, how are they going to do it and everything? This woman comes out there with a poster and everything and says, you got to convert. And it's crazy. She's willing to face that. We have to move against the flow of everything. But it says here that even when we do so, we can have fears and stuff, but it is always going to end up in God's hands. He's going to protect us. We continue to read. It says in verse 14 through 16. So he agreed to do this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any other of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Not only are your convictions going to make it harder on yourself, but it's going to upset a lot of other people. You want to think about like those that were eating the king's food. That's awesome, like professional chefs and stuff, and get taken and eating vegetables. I only could think about how Joe would react, to a plate of just green food. Like this guy would have been mad. But we see here that God's hand was in this, though. Yeah. You think 10 days is going to make that much of a difference? 100% not. All of us that were going on a diet wish that this could be like that, right? If I could just go 10 days and you can see the difference, we wish. But no, God was with them. Yeah. God was showing obviously that he was with them. See, this should not shock us, though, that God is with those who do not compromise in their relationship with him. There are so few people willing to stand up for God, then and now. Why shouldn't he be there with us? 100%. Of all the people that were in exile, only these 4 were making a stand. Only these 4. We don't know how many people went with them, but only these 4 were making a stand. Do you fear that if you stand and make a stand in your relationship, that God won't help you? And that's the biggest reason why we probably start to compromise. Is if I even stand for these small things, what if my job fires me? What if my family gets mad? What if I upset some people? Do you believe that God is going to be there for you? See, instead, we see here that he resolved in his heart and God was with him. See, we don't ask time off from work. We tell them that they're not coming. That's what it means to make a stand. You don't ask permission to follow God. You just start walking with Jesus. People don't like it. They're going to have to deal with it and eat vegetables. Right? They're going to have to be based because God is going to move things out of the way. See, everyone was called to this food, but only 4 men decide to change. We can't think that by playing by the same rules that, God's going to work through it and everything's going to be okay. It doesn't work that way. If we think, let's just go along with the world, and then it's going to work. It doesn't make any sense. We have a relationship with the ruler of the universe. This should give us confidence. It's kind of like, I see it all the time, especially because, especially in Islander culture, everyone's your cousin. And so we'll show up to like a restaurant or something like that, and Sione would know somebody, and the person will go, well, hey, come on, get some food and everything. I know when we went to, Polyfest, Sione knew a lot of people, and they're trying to just hand us plates of food and everything. And that's kind of like us with our relationship with God. Like, God is the owner of this world. If we have a relationship with Him, we are going to be on the good side.
Yeah.
We're going to get handed plates of food. Everything's going to work for us. But do you live your life like that without compromise? Let's continue to read and finish off this story here in just chapter 1. Verse 17 through 21. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding in all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar, that is the king. The king talked to them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians in encounters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. We see here that God continued to lift them up in the land of exile. He gave them this blessing, but this is not obviously where the story is going to stop. We see here that good things are happening, but we're going to see that each one of them starts to get tested. Sometimes we can think to ourselves, well, hey, I can't compromise because God put me in this position. God gave me this education. God gave me this job, and 100%. But you also have to recognize that God gave you that to test you. Yeah. God puts us in positions to test you there. See, God brought these people up in the land of exile, and we're going to see that He's going to test them. Yeah. He's going to go like, hey, do you like this position? Or are you still holding with me? They're going to be tested with death, tested to renounce God, tested to bow down to their gods again in Babylon, but they're going to still hold on to their convictions. God gave you the job to see if you're willing to quit. God gave you a loving family to see if you love Him first. God gave you talents to see if you're going to use it for Him or for the world. My last challenge is, again, seek God with all of your heart. Do not allow anything to get in any way of it. If you are too busy studying to study the Bible, then you are just too busy. Quit something. Quit something in your life. See that you're compromising. If your job calls you, quit your job. Like, have no compromise in your relationship with God. See, because a lot of people will say that, because nobody will ever say, I don't want a deeper relationship with God. Very rarely will people say that. But people will say, I just want a deeper relationship with God later. Like, you just got me in the wrong time. See, Satan doesn't ever get you to say never. He just gets you to say later. Have this conviction to do it now.
Come on.
Set up your relationship with God. Don't allow anything to compromise it. And let's continue to be faithful in exile. We are followers of Jesus in exile. This changes nothing to our calling.
Right.
It starts small, but it will always end up in His hands. Thank you very much.